Hello, everyone. Last time I went over how to load film into an SLR. Now I want to explain exposure settings in the process of film photography and how to use them to expose an image in the way that you want. I will mainly be explaining the basics of the exposure triangle. There are other more complex practices such as Sunny 16 rules or zone metering, but I won't be discussing those today. Now, what is exposure? When we take photos, we want to ensure that we get enough light so that the image doesn't look overly dark, but we don't want to get so much light that it looks overly bright. It's worth noting that this is just a general guideline, and you can make artistic choices to darken or brighten your frame, which is fine, but understanding how you can achieve such things is important for your photography. By definition, exposure is the amount of light that reaches your film, or in the case of digital photography, the camera's sensor. It creates visual data over a period of time. Now we have celluloid film, which contains emulsion layers that are light sensitive. They contain tiny silver halide crystals that are suspended in gelatin. Light interacts with these crystals and works to create a latent image, which is an invisible pattern in the silver. Then there are steps to develop the film so that you can see the negative image on the actual strip of film and scan or print these images. In modern digital cameras, a sensor replaces this film. Now here's an example. This image, we can see that on the left, it's bright and it's blown out, whereas on the right, it's dark and shadowy. In the middle, this is more true to what the eye sees and what most people would call a proper exposure. Now we go on to the exposure triangle. There are three settings that we care about when exposing our image. Those settings are ISO, aperture, and shutter speed. First of all, we can go over aperture. In photography, the term aperture refers to the opening in a lens through which the light passes to reach the camera sensor or film. It's measured in f numbers or f-stops, such as f2.8 or f5.6. They represent the size of the opening relative to the focal length of the lens. A lower f-stop means a larger opening. Meanwhile, a higher f-stop means a smaller opening. The size of the opening affects how much light will then reach the film. The size of the opening will also affect your depth of field, which is the range of distance in the scene that appears in focus. Having a shallow depth of field with a low f-stop is often desired for blurring backgrounds and isolating subjects. This is used a lot in portraiture, and here are a few examples. As we can see, we've isolated the subject and we've blurred the background. Sometimes people will call this blurring of the background bokeh. Now, having a deep depth of field means that it's easier to pull focus, and it also means that more will be in focus at different zones in the scene. This is often preferred for street photography, where you may be zone focusing and taking photos in a quick moment without the time to stop and focus. Now we go on to shutter speed. In photography, shutter speed refers to the length of time that the camera shutter remains open to allow the light to reach the camera's sensor of film. It's typically measured in fractions of a second, such as 1/1000th or 1/250th or 1/60th, etc. A faster shutter speed, like 1/1000th of a second, means that the shutter remains open for a shorter duration, allowing less light to reach the film. A slower shutter speed, like 1/60th of a second, would mean that the shutter remains open for a longer duration, allowing more light to reach the sensor. Not only does it affect the amount of light, but it also affects how you capture motion. A faster shutter speed freezes motion, resulting in a sharp, crisp image of a moving subject, while a slower shutter speed introduces motion blur, capturing the movement of subjects over time. Then we can go on to ISO. In the context of film photography, ISO refers to the film speed or sensitivity to light. ISO stands for International Organization for Standardization, and they set the standards for many different things, but for here we're talking about photography. Different films have different ISO ratings because they are engineered with varying levels of light sensitivity. This sensitivity is determined by the size and composition of the silver halide crystals that are in the film emulsion layers. Because the ISO changes, how much light is needed for proper exposure, it means that an ISO 400 film stock would need different aperture and or shutter speed settings in order to achieve the exact same exposure on an ISO 800 film stock. So that comes to setting ISO. On cameras with built-in light meters, setting the ISO will automatically adjust its shutter speed recommendations to account for the changes in the light sensitivity. When your ISO is low, from around 50 to 200, that means that it needs more light to be properly exposed. And this is usually good in very bright conditions like daylight photography. When your ISO is high, around 800 and higher, that means that your film is more light sensitive, therefore needing less light to be properly exposed. This benefits photography in lower light conditions, and it also is good for freezing action because you can use faster shutter speeds, which generally speaking give you less light. But since you have that high ISO, it compensates for the lack of light that you're receiving. On cameras with built-in or on cameras without built-in light meters, there is no setting the ISO mechanically. ISO is something that you would just usually account for on a separate light meter or with mental rules such as Sunny 16. So essentially, the ISO is only changing the recommendations that a light meter makes because ISO is just indicative of the film light sensitivity. There are other things to consider in film photography, like tending towards slight overexposure, since with negative film, it has more latitude in capturing the highlights than in the shadows. Generally, though, everything previously discussed is a good starter to understanding exposure for your images. Thank you.